La sénatrice Dupuis.
Senator Dupuis, please. On debate. Honourable colleagues, I rise to speak today about Bill C-45. And allow me to talk about the important role that Senator Dean played in providing us with a huge amount of information. He also organized an information session so that we could understand more about this bill. The question of legalizing cannabis in Canada didn't start with the speech from the throne in 2015 when the federal government committed to passing a bill that would legalize, regulate, and restrict the use and access to cannabis. In fact, the substance has been consumed in many countries with no restriction for many years. It's been used for medical, ritual, and recreational uses, among others. Growing, possessing, importing, and exporting drugs has been discussed by many countries for over a century. Egypt had the first legal ban on the use, growth, and import of cannabis in 1868. That's 150 years ago, just after Canada was created. Other Mediterranean countries like Turkey and Greece, where consumption of marijuana was significant, followed. And then there was South Africa in 1922 and Canada in 1923. Many of these countries were very active internationally within the League of Nations, which preceded the UN. During the work that led to the Hague Convention in 1912 and the Hague Conference in 1924 concerning opium, morphine, and cocaine, some of these states proposed adding cannabis to the list as the same list as these three other drugs. Cannabis was ultimately added to the International Convention on Opium in 1925, but this only banned the export from countries where cannabis was illegal. After that, there were other laws in European countries to ban cannabis. In the 1930s, after pressure from Egypt, countries continued with the banning of cannabis. In 1961, the Convention on Narcotics of the UN was passed, and this consolidated many multilateral treaties about drug control between 1912 and 1953. This convention allows for the
import, distribution of, trade in, use and possession of cannabis sont autorisés exclusivement.
It says that this is authorized only for medical and scientific purposes. The 2014 report from the Transnational Institute entitled The Rise and Decline of Cannabis Prohibition, The History of Cannabis in the UN Drug Control System and Options for Reform, states that since the convention was signed in 1961, an increasing number of initiatives were taken to authorize cannabis use for uses other than medical and scientific ones. The authors of the report talk about successive waves of soft detections and lenient policies since the signing of the convention in 1961. In a report of the UN Office Against Drugs and Crime from 2006, it says that many states have stopped treating cannabis-linked activities as criminal acts. The World Drug Report of 2006 presents itself as the first global international study of drugs internationally. It was led by the UN because of the lack of data concerning drug trafficking. There's a special chapter dedicated to cannabis, which is considered as the most widely used drug and most widely sold drug in the world, and a drug that is consumed in almost every country of the world. I'd like to quote the report.
Failed to come to terms with cannabis as a drug. In some countries, cannabis use and trafficking are taken very seriously, while in others, they are virtually ignored. This incongruity undermines the credibility of the international system, and the time for resolving global ambivalence on this issue is long overdue. C'était un rapport de 2006.
That's from a 2006 report. In Canada, The federal parliament passed an act to regulate certain drugs and other substances in 1996. It bans some substances, including cannabis, in its natural or synthetic form. And it also incorporates various international obligations into Canadian law, particularly those relating to cannabis. This act gives the Minister of Health the power to exempt certain people from the law if there is a public interest in doing so. For example, if there are medical or scientific ends. Individual exemptions for marijuana use started in 1999. The use of cannabis for medical purposes was directly influenced by the decisions of Canadian courts starting in the early 2000s, including the Parker decision, that's from the Ontario Court of Appeal, which invalidated the sections of the law that banned Mr. Parker from growing and consuming marijuana in order to reduce the number of epilepsy crises that he endured, because regular drugs hadn't worked for him. The regulation concerning marijuana access for medical ends in 2001 was then adopted. This regulation, the next regulation adopted in 2013, aims to authorize the use of and growth of cannabis for medical ends by patients and designated persons. It also allows for commercial growth and distribution. Sections 4 and 5 of this Act were declared invalid by the Supreme Court of Canada in February 2016, and because they ban the possession of cannabis for medical ends in the Smith decision of the Supreme Court and the Allard decision. The 2013 regulation was then repealed by the adoption of the regulation on the access to cannabis for medical ends, which was adopted in 2016 by the federal cabinet. And the regulation maintained personal exemptions, licenses for distributors, and licenses for the growth of cannabis, which had been allowed under previous edicts. Many people who spoke on C-45 referred to different parliamentary organizations that studied this question in Canada. For example, the Commission of Inquiry into non-medical uses of marijuana in the 1970s, and two Senate committees in 1996 and 2002, as well as the work of the House Committee in 2002. Bill C-45 proposes maintaining the current system for having access to medical marijuana, and also broadening the authorization by controlling and regulating the production, distribution, and sale of cannabis. This is something that Uruguay, 8 American states, and the District of Columbia have already done. Bill C-45 proposes maintaining the ban on importing and exporting cannabis except for medical or scientific ends, and except the hemp industry. It's clear that the question of cannabis has been discussed. It's been challenged in court. It's been regulated. And so, in other words, there has been a constant dialogue between the 3 levels of the state, so the legislative, executive, and judiciary branches. And this has been the case for many decades. We can't ignore this as legislators as we study this Bill C-45 today. As written, Bill C-45, in my opinion, raises a number of issues. Some of these issues concern me more than others. I would invite my colleagues who are on the committees that study this bill to consider the 3 following questions. First, the product itself. As has been clearly shown by the Vice Chair of the Working Group on Cannabis Legalization, cannabis is a class of drugs and not a single product. And the different cannabis products can vary greatly in terms of their THC concentration. Dried cannabis used to be consumed in the 1960s, It was made from certain parts of the plant. And now today there is an almost unlimited number of products made from different parts of the plant, which can be smoked, eaten, drunk, applied to the body, and so on. And the concentrations can vary up to as high as 90% of THC content. There doesn't seem to be a maximum limit of THC that would be safe. And so setting a limit is difficult to do. There's no consensus. Even though it's clear that the more THC there is in it, the more psychoactive effect there is. During testimony on February 14th before the committee studying C-46, a bill that has to do with impaired driving due to alcohol and drugs, Dr. Amy Peer, president of the committee for studying impaired driving, said the following.
I think that they're quite right in that the potency of THC has increased dramatically over the years. Whereas in years past, you would have marijuana strains with 2 to 3% THC. Now they are regularly between 20 and 40%. There's also an increasing frequency of having THC concentrates in which the THC is extracted from the marijuana, and then you can get it to concentrations ranging from 70 to 90%. This THC can be added to concentrates, vaporized, put into edibles, many different formulations. One of the difficulties is that a lot of the scientific literature has not been able to focus on these high concentrations of THC. If you look at the literature, what's commonly referred to as high potency THC is looking at concentrations of up to 12.6%, which really does not reflect what's out there in the market today.
So to my colleagues who are studying Bill C-45 in committee, I would invite you to pay particular attention to this question of limiting THC content in these new products that will be authorized. Secondly, for more than 15 years, the use of cannabis for medical ends has been authorized and regulated as long as the patient has a medical document. This is the term used in the law. In other words, they need a recommendation or referral from a doctor or nurse practitioner. The idea behind this authorization is that cannabis can provide relief to certain people, adults and children, who suffer from certain diseases. Even though it can't be prescribed by a doctor because it's not recognized as a drug or a treatment, it can be used, produced, distributed, and sold. This is authorized and regulated under the law. So the social message that has been widespread for the last 15 years is that medical use of marijuana is considered to provide beneficial effects to those who use it, whether they be adults or children, if they have certain diseases. There's still some discomfort around the issue of limits because doctors have to provide patients with a medical document rather than prescribing a drug if they want to give these patients access. And there's actually no scientific data to that effect. Many doctors' associations who have spoken out on this issue feel that it is inappropriate for doctors to continue to authorize access to cannabis. The patients' groups who were heard from by the working group insist that there is a beneficial effect and that cannabis helps relieve their pain and it has a beneficial effect on their health. In my opinion, we need to ask what social message will be communicated by broadening the use of cannabis and allowing the use of recreational marijuana. For example, if a family doctor has a very young patient who goes to primary school and cannabis seems to relieve their epilepsy, how will that family doctor explain to the patient's older brother that it's very dangerous for him to consume cannabis? If the older brother is in 6th grade, for example, how do you explain to that boy that his brain isn't fully developed before the age of 25 and that it's dangerous for him to smoke marijuana? There was a study conducted of a number of young people, and there was a report published in January 2017 entitled Ideas That Young Canadians Have About Cannabis. We do have to use some caution in looking at the results of this study, but the report draws a link between the perceived risk of smoking cannabis and real rates of consumption. What's even more interesting, in my opinion, is that these young people... I'm afraid you're out of time. May I ask for a few additional minutes? Do the senators agree? Yes? Go ahead. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, Madam Speaker. What I find really interesting is that these young people say that their decision to smoke pot was influenced by their desire to do the same thing as their peers and their family members. The third point I want to draw your attention to is that this new regulated market is situated within a context of illegal consumption and distribution, because it's contrary to the law. We estimate that there are billions of dollars worth of profits held by organized crime. And the cannabis market has consequences that are felt by ordinary citizens, both in cities and in rural areas. According to many studies in different countries, the hierarchical structure of the marijuana market means that there are many, many intermediates, many middlemen who traffic marijuana in schools and parks, for example. Other countries are more proactive about studying and the structure of these markets. Furthermore, the Working Group on Cannabis Legalization recommends, based on the problems it's seen, that we should examine the role of designated persons under the current system in the goal of eliminating this category of producer. According to testimony, this network of designated persons that grow marijuana on behalf of medical marijuana users are often used as a pathway into the illicit market. So, colleagues, I would ask you to study this information and information concerning the illicit market in detail in order to deal with the concerning issue of how the current market allows part of the market to be distorted. I would also like to say that the power given to the minister in Bill C-45 in Section 6, which sets up a problem for tracking cannabis, seems problematic to me, because almost all of the experts mentioned the problem of the lack of data and the lack of follow-up and the need to have a very, very specific system for following up the data on cannabis use. In C-45, there is a lot of discretionary power given to the minister to set up such a system or not. Now, I read the health minister's report following her consultations, and that is what the department heard. This system of follow-up is essential and needs to be put in place. So I would invite my colleagues to study that question carefully. Thank you.
Vous avez une question, Sénatrice Saint-Germain?
You have a question, Senator Saint-Germain?
Yes,
Yes, if the senator would take a question. But first, I'd like to make a comment
important.
about the importance of giving this chamber and giving Canadians clear, reliable, and verified information. Earlier in this debate, it was said that in Quebec, the rate of contraband cigarettes consumption had increased following legalization, but that is not correct. The rate of consumption of contraband decreased, and the consumption of legal cigarettes, or rather, so the rate of contraband consumption went down by 63%. And the rate of legal cigarette consumption went down between 3 and 6%. So I just wanted to make that clarification. And this is from the Department of Finance in Quebec that I'm getting this information. So my question for the Senator is, in your study of the bill, do you think that the contracts and the international treaties signed by Canada concerning drug trafficking and drug regulation could be undermined or trampled if the current bill is not changed? Senator Dupuis, I'm afraid your time is up.